name be debated in short form.
The question is the motion of the member. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Mr. President, the motion...
Sorry, can you move it?
I move that way.
Yeah, hang on. You can vote it.
Mr. President, the motion highlights the recent power outages in Sydney, which were exacerbated by the fact that this organisation no longer has the requisite staff to be able to deal with one of the basic necessities of life, and that is electricity provision to the people of New South Wales. And if you look at the nub of the resolution, which is asking that the House calls on the government to comply with its own legislated minimum amount of staff, and that's provide the legal amount, which is 3,570, and to give a commitment to no more job cuts. Mr. President, the issue of privatising electricity was a major one in the last election. It is well known the position that the Labor opposition took on this, along with several stakeholder unions, including the ETU and the USU and Professionals Australia. And notwithstanding the fact that the government won the election, there was a high degree of community angst about this policy. And it's turned out to be well-founded, Mr. President. I worked for that organisation for some 30 years, Mr. President, and I can never remember once the army having to be called out to help with the restoration of supply. And if nothing else, that alone is emblematic of the undercapacity of that now privatised supplier to, as I say, restore supply within a reasonable amount of time. Now, there were people, Mr. President, who were off for over a week, and I've heard the government's characterisation of, 1 in 30-year events, catastrophic events and all the rest of it. It was a significant event, Mr. President, but I've got to tell you, I used to work for that organisation on the front line of supplying electricity, and we had many such events over the course of years, and I can never remember taking over a week to restore supply. We would sometimes take a couple of days, yeah, sure, but to have situations where literally thousands of people were off for over a week is simply unacceptable, and it goes to the byproduct of a privatised distributor. They have no accountability. The government has a 49.5% share, and yet the minister is seemingly powerless to do anything about it, because in private hands they are trying to return a profit to their shareholders. And if they're getting squeezed on the revenue side, guess where the profit comes from? By cutting staff, literally thousands of staff in the space of a few years. In fact, there was one stage, Mr. President, where that organisation, after amalgamation in the 90s, had something like 10,000 staff. They've got something like about 3,300 now. And is it any wonder it takes so long to restore supply? It's patently unacceptable. And what the motion does is ask the minister, they've still got a 49.5% shareholding on it. Presumably the minister's got an interest on what's going on in the board and what staffing levels there are, and whether or not the government's actually complying with its own legislated minimum numbers. When the sales legislation passed through this House in 2015 to privatise this organisation, part of the deal is that there would be job guarantees for 5 years. Those job guarantees expire in June 2020, but an internal Ausgrid document shows in black and white that they've actually fallen below that minimum legislated requirement. Now, you would expect, after the catastrophic events we've seen where people have been blacked out for weeks on end, that the government would be thinking, well, perhaps that organisation doesn't have the capacity anymore to restore supply to the citizens of New South Wales, and it's time we stepped into the fray and looked into this and make sure they are adequately resourced, because it's not good enough. We told you that privatisation wouldn't work. You said it was going to result in more reliable supply and lower prices. In fact, the exact opposite's happened, and it's taken 5 years for you to wake up that there's a problem. So the motion calls for the staff to be retained, no more job cuts, and to stick by the legislated minimum amount of $3,570. I put the motion.